So Judges, I kind of view a lot of what happens in Judges as sort of a transactional, okay, because they come in, they do the thing, and they go out. Okay. We also talked about it sort of being a cyclical, because Israel kind of falls into the same traps and never really are able to get out of that. And so tonight we're going to talk about Othniel, and I'm hoping to get to it from Othniel through at least Jer, if possible. I know, you're laughing to yourself. One of the things that they have an issue with at this time is that they did not recognize the king that they did have. That is really the problem. It says that there was no king, but of course, it's sort of, kind of a play on words, if you will. They were looking for a king. They kind of had this propensity. They were kind of worrying over it. And we'll see that tonight, even in some of the judges that take over, and at least one especially, that is not a judge, but is found within this reading. But the real issue is the last part of the sentence, isn't it? When you don't have an authority, and in this case, God being the ultimate, and when you don't recognize the king, which was God, then everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And what we read here in Judges is the result of that, isn't it? Everyone kind of doing, what they wanted to do. And in doing that, they get into trouble. Trouble with God. There are about 12 of them. We're going to spend a little more time on Samson because it's such a broad subject, and we know that one well, but there's a lot of detail there that we can pull out that might help us today. We won't get into Samuel, which some include in the list. Samuel is its own study. We will talk about Abimelech, who is not in the list because he's not a judge, okay, but he is in these verses, in these chapters that we are reading, because he is someone's relative. Right? Okay, and so we'll talk about that. Let me see if I can get through this. Okay. The last part, the last couple of times that we talked, Samson is kind of the intro to it, and then there's 3 chapters where they just walk off God's earth, okay, in terms of listening to anything he's taught. So we'll get into that and the immorality that seems to come out. After, once again, don't forget, many are following what's right in their own eyes. They're not really following God. Okay, Othniel's found in part of chapter 3, and it's interesting to me. Back up in 3 and verse 4, we're told why these other nations were allowed to remain in that area. What were they supposed to do? Go in and replace them, right? Weren't they? Displace them, replace them. Really, they were to remove them, especially remove their idols. Well, verse 4 is interesting because it tells us why they were left there. It says they were for the testing of Israel. Now, let's go down to verse 5. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they intermarried and interchanged beliefs and served their gods, these nations' gods. So, did they fail the test or did they pass the test? It was there for a test. So, how did it go? They failed dramatically, didn't they? They failed the test. The test was really meant to show they were willing to not participate in worship that was not God's will, and then there were other things, intermarrying with those that were not of like faith and things such as that. So, is it any wonder that they had some difficulty? I call it the troubles. It was kind of interesting to me that that's what Dublin and Ireland called the IRA, where during the troubles, okay, Well, it's kind of similar in the way. Yes, it was more unfortunately spiritually based, and it separated him from God in those days, which is a little different than, or maybe is not so much from the what happened during the Troubles in Ireland. But similar idea, troubles. Okay, they got some problems. All right, so let's look at Othniel for a minute, and if you remember, I tried to have something that showed the cycle, the flow, that repeats so often through these chapters. And so it starts off with identifying or recognizing Israel doing something, some evil, in other words, separating themselves from God. Another way to put that is they apostatize, they leave God's will, leave his law, right? And the troubles that they had were the intermarrying with the local people that are living among them, and then giving their daughters to them to marry, and then their sons marrying the daughters of those nations that were around them. God considered that to be evil, okay, doing that. Okay, so then we see God sends oppressors because they are doing evil, so they get, and this is a time when, God dealt directly, didn't he? He dealt directly with Israel. And so if he were going to punish someone, they would get punished in this life. We know that we have this kind of issue in that we too could be punished if we don't follow God's will and we're not following what he wants us to do. But it's going to be more of a spiritual thing that we fail, and it's eternity that is in the balance. Okay, here, their very lives, in some cases, were in the balance, right? Their mortal lives, okay, not their eternal lives only. Okay. Well, so, the oppressor in this case is the king of Mesopotamia, and I do have a map after this to kind of show. Does anyone know where Mesopotamia is today? I can't hear. Iraq is up near it. It's kind of like if you've ever used one of those funny, pillows on a plane. Okay, kind of looks like that up there. Okay, Ur's in it. Okay, we used to call it when I was a kid. I'm still a kid, but when I was a younger kid, we used to call it the Fertile Crescent, right? And that's kind of where Mesopotamia was at. And so you got that in your minds now, but I'll show you a map here in a minute. But that's where they are from, okay? And we noted that they have to either repent or they have to cry out to the Lord to ask for forgiveness or ask for delivery, don't they? And so they do that. And they do that in this case here. And if you want to follow along, I tried to put the verses up there, but in chapter 3, verses 5 through 11, you'll find Othniel, okay, and what happens to him. But verse 9 says the people of Israel cried to the Lord, and they cried to him because of the oppression that they were under with the king of Mesopotamia. And he has a name I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it is interesting that he was very, very powerful. Okay? It was rich and powerful. When you own the Fertile Valley, or the Fertile Crescent, if you will, okay, you have really the world by the tail at that time, okay? And so he was very powerful. But verse 10 tells us something, and you'll see this in a couple of other places. Because, God brings Othniel to deliver them, okay? And in verse 10, it says, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. Okay? And that is a key. Okay? There is in the reading someone who sets himself up as a leader. Okay? And you have fail after fail after fail when that happens. And then they have to have someone else who comes in who God is the Spirit's on them from God, and then they will rescue them from what's happening. So Othniel, after he delivered them, from this king, they had quite a rest. Okay, this is one of the longer periods of rest that they have. Now, what can happen during a rest period? Okay, we like rest periods, don't we? And sometimes we call them vacations, or sometimes we take a sabbatical, or things like that, right? So what can happen? A good thing can happen, and a not so good thing can happen, right? Now, the good thing is you can kind of, restore your energy, you can get your acuity back, you can be sharp, you may learn something new, you may read a bunch of books, or you lay around, you can lay around, eat junk food and watch TV all day. And then at the end of your, whatever it is, sabbatical, rest, whatever, you're worse off than you were before you started your rest. Well, sometimes you kind of see that happen in these cycles. They get 40 years of rest, but they don't always seem to end that rest in a better place than before they started. Okay. Matter of fact, they tend to, if there was a needle, that was measuring this, you would kind of see the needle going from restore to empty, right? And then next thing you know, they've engaged in something that they should not do. Because we're going to look at another king. Well, okay, so here's the map. I think I got it blowed up a little. So see where Mesopotamia is? It's sort of, it owns all of it. It's got Assyria up there, and you've got Iraq on one side. You got okay, where Abraham was from. Okay, so all of that area in there, Babylon, so on, that was the Fertile Valley, okay, of that time, or Fertile Crescent, excuse me. And that's where Mesopotamia was at. Okay, let's look at Ehud, which is in this same chapter, beginning in verse 12. But what does the very first sentence say when you start talking about Ehud? Okay, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So they had 40 years of rest, which seemed to lead them into failing, right? And that's not an unusual situation. I remember when I worked for this one company, which was highly cyclical. It was a trucking industry, and they made huge Class 7, 8 trucks. Well, you don't buy them every year, so it was a highly cyclical company. When we were doing great, we did terrible. When we were doing terrible, we did better. Okay, why? Well, we just didn't know what to do when everything was going our way. Okay, we just didn't do well. It seems sometimes that happens in these cycles. Okay, they don't do so well when they have, in this case, the 40 years. Okay, let's look at Ehud for a second. Okay, see if I can catch up on my screen here. Okay, they don't really go into the issue, except that the way that's phrased, that they again did what was evil. Okay, so the again tells me it's something they had done before, so that's why I use the word same. Okay, similar issues were going on at the end of the 40-year period as was going on when Othniel, okay, had been the judge. Okay, and so they're marrying still. They're going after Baal, and God then punishes them. He sends an oppressor. Okay, sorry. Eglon, the king of Moab, comes in and starts to oppress Israel. Okay, and he pulls in Ammon. He pulls in Amalek or Amalekites. Okay, and so for 18 years they oppress the children of Israel. Verse 15 says, they did what we saw before. The people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and he raised a deliverer. Okay, Ehud was the deliverer. Right there. Now, some things are said about him. They're not that important, but they are interesting. So he was a left-handed man. What did we used to do in this country when someone was left-handed? Let's go back 100 years ago. Yes. And they were kind of the same way. They looked at people who were left-handed like there was something wrong with them. Okay? And that's a little bit interesting. But for some reason, Benjamin had an abundance of men that were left-handed. And not only that, but they were extremely good at fighting battles. Okay? And Ehud was a Benjamite. And he was a left-handed man, which is just kind of throws me for seeing that. But it's important to the overall account, isn't it? So Israel cries out to the Lord, and Ehud is sent to rescue them from a very mean, ferocious enemy. Okay, none of these are nice countries at that time to fall prey to. Okay. Now, when you look at this, there is a backstory to what happens. Ehud is a little different in that he personally took care of this. Do you remember the account of how he went about doing that? He made himself a sword, dagger, whatever, right? Something that could be a little concealed. And because he was left-handed, and this is one of the reasons why in ancient times and not so ancient, people thought something was wrong with left-handed people, because he could sneak up on someone who was thought that if anything bad was going to happen, it's going to come from his right hand, right? And instead it came from his left hand. And so he stabs, he kind of makes up a story. He goes to Ehud, he acts like he's going to give him tribute, right? And instead of doing that, he gets him alone and he kills him. And in that way, then that's how he began. That is just really the beginning, okay? Because when he came back from doing that, he got Ephraimites to come out, and they got, I think it was, I don't think they said how big the army was, but they had taken the lives of 10,000 Moabites, okay, by the time they were done fighting. And Moab was subdued then on that day. So, last one, Othniel was 40 years. Ehud saves them for 80 years. This was really a tremendous, I call it building safe space, okay, in the country. If they had done that when they moved into the country, then a lot of problems would not have happened. But they didn't. They waited. And so now they're having to go in and fight individually to overcome the oppressors, okay? And it's interesting in that it's like they don't, how do I put it? They don't know how to live where there's always rest, right? Because at the end of the 80 years, something happens. Now, there's a person in between that's sort of sandwiched in between here. It's a little difficult to know exactly where he's from, not where he's from, but how he fits into the overall flow here. But this was Shamgar. Remember Shamgar? Okay, so Shamgar was a mighty warrior, wasn't he? And he also delivered Israel. And we see that he's only got one verse dedicated to him. Now, that's effectiveness. When only one verse is attributed to you, but you're in the list of those that are judges in saving Israel. Okay? Because the last two words, in the ESV, okay, the last two words in the ESV for that sentence says, saved Israel. Okay? So whatever he did, however he did it, where he did it, you don't get all of that backdrop here to him. But what you do get is what he did do saved Israel. Okay? And so in that way, then, he is one of the judges. And we see that there are 6 individuals that are called, if you will, minor judges, although it's a list that I don't know how anyone's a minor except that the amount of verses attributed to you. Yes. Didn't they get 80 years? Yeah. So what Sandy's saying is that it seemed like there was a dearth of leadership and willingness to step up and be a leader. Now, we'll see that because later the people cast about and say, who will come and lead us against the Ammonites, And so they're begging for someone to come and do it. It's interesting that that's how they live. Okay, but we see here in these stories or the accounts of these minor prophets that there were what's the word I'm trying to say? Times when some cleanup needed to be done, if you will, and so it seemed that the minor judges came in when there was maybe some strengthening that was needed or some event was happening and some power needed to be shown or something like that. And in this case, Shamgar, did this. Who's next? Okay, so Deborah and Barak, but really Deborah is considered the judge, although Barak gets mentioned in Hebrews. But that's for another story. Okay, that's for another lesson. But so we see that. No, did I not go through this? Okay. See, we didn't even have any time. We didn't even know how long it was that he could have maybe stretched part of the 80. We just don't know. So Deborah is the 4th judge. We see that in chapter 4. I think there are some, and probably it's mostly the major judges. We know their accounts, right? I mean, we teach them to our kids. We talk about them a lot and things like that. And Deborah is a unique situation. Same as the rest of them, but unique in that she is also what? She is a judge in the sense that she will be in charge and take Barak to be in charge of a military thing. But what else is she? She was a judge, a judge of maybe civil matters, maybe the law, something like that, okay? And verse 4 calls her a prophetess, okay? And she would sit under a tree, it says, and it was called the Palm of Deborah. So this was a place she went to, and people would come to her and ask, her the kinds of questions that they would want to have answered from God in the sense of law questions, civil questions, fairness questions, and so on, okay? And she would judge in that way. Now, though, she's going to be a judge like the other judges. She's going to be have a military leadership that she's going to be asked to step into. So the trouble in this case, they talk about Baal, they talk about Asherah. These really are, if you will, the cultural idols of these countries that are left in, the tribes that are left in there, the different cities that we talked about, all the ites, okay, that were left there. Okay, these are their gods or forms of their gods. Chemos is a form of related somewhat to Baal. So we see that the oppressor in this case is Jabin, king of Canaan. And the Canaanites are not easy prey. Okay. This is a very hard time. And the commander of his army is Sisera. I think, didn't the young class have this recently, studied this? Because Sisera ends up getting killed by who? Jael. And and it's interesting that the whole weakness, if you will, of some of the male leaders of the time is they really didn't look out for the females. Okay, and that was many of their downfalls. Okay, let's talk about Barak for a minute. Okay, because Barak. Deborah calls Barak. What evidently was Barak? General or the leader of the armies, okay? So she calls him naturally, if you will, to come and to do that and to lead them. But Barak in verse 8 says what? If you go, I'll go. Now, there's some speculation, and this is just that. We don't get a lot more detail here about why he did that, okay? But she says immediately, I will surely go with you. But then she adds that nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. And, I think that's interesting because it kind of gives you a little insight with Barak, doesn't it? Because I don't think she would have said that if there was some issue there, okay, with that, okay. But and he doesn't really know what she means, does he? Yet, because she says that the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman, but he doesn't know what that means, okay, exactly. And a woman will play a role in yet another. One of the accounts that are in these chapters that we're reading. Now, so they fight. Deborah and Barak are successful, but Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army, right, runs into a tent, and Jael, who is, and this was an interesting. I tend to maybe agree in that what some thought was the women built most of these tents. Okay, they would set them up. They basically ran all of that, and she knew how to use a tent hammer, okay, or whatever you want to call that. And so she drove a tent peg into Sisera's temple. And on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. Not an easy thing to win, but the Lord was with them. And we see this because what does Deborah do? She writes a song, right? And generally, why does someone write a song? Two reasons. One, things didn't go very well, or things went really well, okay? And so I think that's kind of what we see here. I think things went well. So they write a song of joy. And I kind of wanted to walk through this because in this song, unlike some of them, there is a structure, it feels like, okay, when we go through here. So let's look at some of this. Okay, I can't read that back there. Can you read it at all? Okay, well, the block says what's in the line. Okay, so you don't have to read anything else. It starts out in the first 3 verses talking about God's previous interventions, the success they've had with him, and they draw parallels to what had happened with Sinai, and so they're basically driving this theme, the joy of blessing in being a willing instrument of God, is really what this song is about. Then God's intervention, verses 4 and 5, God's previous interventions. Okay, they continue to kind of expound, if you will, and you can see that in here. You talk about the seer, talk about the region of Edom, etc. Okay, these are all the mountains quaking in verse 5. Okay, so these are all things that they had seen. Now, if you had seen all of these things, I think that we would maybe take that to heart a little more than sometimes it appears that they do. Okay. Then they kind of go into verses 6 to 8, the apostasy, if you will, the things that, like here, my heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves. Okay, no, that's the wrong verse. Up in verse beginning with verse 6, we talk about the highways being abandoned, travelers kept to the byways. Why would one do that? Not safe, right? So you didn't take the main roads because that's where all the criminals were hanging out. Okay. Then I think they talk about praising willing participants, and kind of this, Sandy, this kind of goes a little bit to your point. I don't think there were a lot of examples of that, okay, but there were commanders of Israel. Deborah talks about that in verse 9, and I think she's kind of expounding on their willingness, if you will, to offer themselves for battle. And in those days, a lot of them did die in battle, had that chance to die, if you will, although God did help them a lot. In verses 12 to 19, she recounts the battle, okay, and here the song then relives what happened, if you will. And then they celebrate the heroes, verses 20 to 24, okay. And you can kind of see through here the joy, if you will, of having these heroes, such as Jael. Jael is called out in this, specifically in verse 24. Okay. And last but not least, Sisera's downfall. Okay, so we see that in the last ending, if you will, of the 25 down to the end of the chapter. And then it says that in verse 31, and the land had rest for 40 years. Okay? So that was a successful judgeship, if you will. Okay. Okay, now next we will come to Gideon. Okay? But chapter 6 starts out, if you will, kind of laying out the oppression a little more. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of that details, but there were 40 years of rest back in the last part of chapter 5. And but what is the very first sentence in chapter 6? The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay? And he gave them into the hand of Midian, the Midianites, for 7 years. Okay? And then it goes into verses 2 to 6. It goes into kind of describing what that was like. And this was interesting because they would come and they would take their livestock, they would take their food. Basically they were starving. Okay, And so they did cry out. So let's look at this cycle here. Okay, it's the cycle that leads up to Gideon. The trouble is the same trouble that they've been having, idol worshiping. Their oppressors is Midian, the Amalekites, and it seems that they are under some kind of oppression for 6 years. People cry out. Now Gideon gets called. Now, the last part here in where it's kind of recounting what's been going on to them. It says that verse 7 that the people cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, and then the Lord sends a prophet to them. And what does the prophet do? In that verse 8, last part of verse 8. He's God's mouthpiece, isn't he? And he tells them what God is thinking right then. So God is saying, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But you have not obeyed my voice. Now that's the key, the last part. So they had not obeyed the voice. Okay, we're still going to talk about Gideon for a while here. Hang on. So Israel's apostasy then brings them back into servitude. And they are going to be crying out to God again. That's their bondage. I should have been going through this when I was talking. In response to Israel's cry to the Lord, God sends the prophet. An angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, beginning in verse 3, and it starts with, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So there is a number of interactions here between the angel and Gideon. Now, verse 12 says what about Gideon? The last phrase. What does that say? He calls him, O mighty man of valor. Okay. And verse 13, though, we find Gideon saying, who, me? And that's the interaction, isn't it? The interaction between the angel and Gideon, and the angel really having to prove to Gideon that God's going to be with him, and that because of that, he was going to be able to do what God is asking of him to do. Okay.
You can do that in the Contacts app.
Siri decided to talk to me. Okay, so Gideon's call then is called to God's service at verses 14 to 16. And I think that we see the storyline or the account is astounding, isn't it? Basically, Gideon pushes back numerous times, and he asks for signs, doesn't he? Various signs, several signs. And because of that, he finally, I think, gets enough support, kind of back to the leadership issue, the dearth of leading. He finally gets to the point of accepting that he is going to go and do this for God. In verses 17 to 21, though, he asks for a sign. So the angel asks him to take meat, unleavened cakes, put it on a rock, pour the broth over it. He did that. It sounds a little bit like what? The the combat that between Baal and who? Elijah? Elisha? Which one is it? Huh? So he wanted them to soak this food, didn't he? And why did he want them to soak it? Well, because he was going to make a point, wasn't he? And so a fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes and so on. If you've ever tried to start a fire with wet wood, you know it's not going to work out too well. So it's unusual, right? It's not something that would normally happen. And so it's a sign, if you will, to Gideon that God is with him. But it's really not enough, if you will, for Gideon, because he's going to want some more signs as a result. Okay, but there is a miraculous sign, and that night he offers his father's bull, and he cuts down the altar, or pulls down the altar of Baal, and cuts down Asherah, which, if you remember right, that's really it's kind of a wooden form. Okay? It doesn't really always take the form of a person. And so it's going to be a problem. That's going to start a problem in the city. So this account, if you will, of Gideon is going to take 3 or 4 chapters to really come to a conclusion. But removing Baal from their midst was a problem, and we'll pick up here because I want to show a little bit more about the last part of Gideon and him then gathering up his army. Because where are we headed with this? We know he's going to defeat the enemy, but it's going to be very unusual. It's going to be another one of those unusual weapons that we've never seen. Yes?